I put on the dress like I was stepping into a promise, one last taste of beauty before the world took me. I didn't expect the man who destroyed that promise to be the person who would fight to keep it alive. My name is Isabella Hart. For months, cancer had been the quiet, unwelcome lodger in my body, the kind of roommate you can't evict. Doctors measured my life in appointments, my family measured it in cautious words, and I measured it in the small things that still made me feel like myself. My last item on the list was simple: a proper dinner at Lumiere de Paris, the best French restaurant in Houston. I wanted to sit under the chandeliers, taste something rich and real, and wear a dress that made me feel like someone worth fighting for. I traveled to the restaurant alone that evening because wishes, somehow, feel more honest when you fulfill them yourself. The dress had been folded in tissue paper at the back of my closet for months. A friend had gifted it on a terrible day when the walls felt too close and my breath was a thin thing. I'd been saving it for a better version of myself that didn't know hospital corridors. The fabric slid over my skin like an apology. I fastened it with trembling fingers and caught myself in the mirror. The woman looking back had a shaved patch from chemo, a faint bruise from a port, and a stubborn steadiness in her jaw. My phone buzzed with well-meaning texts, love, prayers, the usual gentle commands to rest. I deleted a few. This night, I didn't want to explain. I wanted to arrive, sit, eat, and leave with a memory that belonged only to me. The neon skyline of downtown Houston looked like a promise as I walked toward Lumiere. The valet took my jacket with a small bow of practiced politeness. Inside, the dining room smelled of butter and thyme, each table set like a tiny island of ceremony. I didn't have a reservation. I had hope. When the maitre d' glanced at me, the look in his eyes was not compassion, it was inventory. He told me the restaurant was full. He told me their policy. He told me, with the soft cruelty people use on those they think fragile, that they didn't accept walk-ins in that kind of dress. I remember wanting to tell him that I hadn't worn the dress to show off. I'd worn it so I could feel brave. I remember the heat rising under my skin like a tide, and then the room tilting and everything losing its edges. I fainted in the doorway. I later learned it was dehydration and too much adrenaline, but in that sliver of darkness, I felt as if the world had finally decided for me. Not tonight. I came back to the world in a hospital room, the light too bright, the sheets too white. A machine counted out my heartbeats like a metronome. A hand was holding mine that felt rough and unfamiliar. Adrian Beaumont. At the restaurant, he had been a story in wine press releases. Handsome, exacting, brilliant at publicity, and cold when necessary. Now, as the fog lifted, he looked smaller. His suit was creased. He hadn't planned to be here. I hadn't planned to faint. Fate, apparently, likes dramatic entrances. You fainted outside my door, he said, voice thin. I called an ambulance. I didn't know what else to do. He sounded like a man who'd broken something he didn't know how to fix. You could have offered water, I said, sarcastic and fragile at the same time. The words came out as a whisper. He flinched, as if the truth hurt him. I should have. He swallowed. I was an idiot. I saw you, and I made assumptions. I'm sorry. People make assumptions for you, I said. You run a 5-star restaurant. Assumptions are your seasoning. He laughed, but it was brittle. We both knew the laugh wasn't enough. Why did you come alone? He asked eventually, softer. There was real curiosity there now. Not the dismissive curiosity of someone sizing a table for profit, but the awkward curiosity of a man who had watched a life wobble and fall and wondered where the pieces belonged. Because I wanted one beautiful night that I would remember, I said. No fuss. No pity. Just food that tasted like art and a dress that felt like courage. He listened like someone who had suddenly been given a new instruction manual for the world. Adrian insisted on walking me out in the evening after the doctor gave me fluids and discharge papers. The night air felt like a balm. He was quiet, which, oddly, was the most intimate thing he'd done. Why did you make assumptions? I asked as we crossed the small parking lot. Because I thought the restaurant was a theater and people who entered it were actors playing expensive parts, he admitted. I assumed you were a liability to that act. I didn't see a person. He looked vulnerable in the dim glow. The confession was rough, but honest. I run everything so precisely that I sometimes forget there are real lives beneath tablecloths. It would have been easy to keep the conversation there, to chalk him up to another privileged man learning a lesson. Except 2 days later, when he visited my tiny apartment with a bouquet of lilies and a stack of papers in his hand. I hate what I did, he said. And I know apologies don't undo humiliation. But I want to make it right. If you'll let me. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to keep my privacy. I wanted my last moments to be mine alone, unbothered by the rich and repentant. Instead, I let him in. He made coffee with a clumsy reverence. He sat on my living room floor because he said sitting at the coffee table felt like one more formality. He started telling me about his childhood in France, about working long nights in kitchens that smelled of caramelized onions and failure, and how the restaurant had been his first and only dream. I thought order mattered most, he said. But watching you collapse at my door, it felt like someone had thrown open a window in a sealed room. I told him about the doctor's prognosis and the nights that felt too long and the mornings that required too much courage. He listened. He learned to sit in silences that were not empty, and he began to bring little things. A magazine about art, a pastry that reminded me of a life before chemo. His visits continued. He never asked for anything in return. He started to call late at night to check how I was feeling. He brought a private chef to my apartment one evening. Not because I needed food, but because he said I deserved the right to a meal that felt like a celebration, not a pity parade. The walls between us shifted from guardrails to thresholds. After a month of quiet care and errands he helped with, and mostly because my strength had started deciding to cooperate for the first time in ages, he suggested something that made my breath catch. Come back to Lumiere, he said, properly, as my guest. It felt odd to accept. The same place where humiliation had been served as a course was being offered again, but this time on his insistence. Maybe I wanted proof that the world wasn't a single story. Maybe I wanted to test whether kindness could rebuild what arrogance had knocked down. On the night we went back, he walked beside me like a man who had finally learned a language of gentleness. The maitre d' bowed when Adrian passed, but his eyes briefly flicked toward me with a new, careful respect. The meal arrived like a whispered celebration. Each course was small and exacting, an apology folded into crème brûlée and a correction hidden in a well-seared scallop. Adrian watched me between bites, not as a critic, but as someone whose pleasure came from seeing another person enjoy the work of his hands. At one point, a woman at the next table raised her glass in quiet salute to me. The simple camaraderie of strangers tasted as sweet as any dessert. That night, when the chandeliers shivered and the city hummed beyond glass, I felt something shift in my chest. For the first time in a long time, the future felt less like a list of losses and more like an open chapter, not because I believed cancer had left, but because someone had chosen to stand beside me anyway. Weeks of treatment followed. There were days when my body felt like a field in winter, and days when sunlight crawled under the curtains and decided to stay. Adrian advocated for me. He pulled strings to get an earlier appointment with a specialist at Topview Medical Center, a hospital perched on a high floor that overlooked the city. I remember being wheeled through the hospital corridors and trying to catalog each small kindness people offered. A nurse who smoothed my blanket, a surgeon who answered questions with patience, the way the afternoon light fell on the linoleum like a promise. The doctors there decided to try an aggressive, new therapy. It was risky, and there were many breathless consultations that felt like coin flips. I agreed to it because being passive sometimes felt like the only form of courage I could manage. Adrian was there in the waiting rooms, pacing like a caged animal at first, then stilling himself when the news was hopeful. He changed into scrubs one morning and walked with the medical team into a meeting, not as a credentialed member of the team, but as someone who refused to let bureaucracy decide my chances. The treatment was brutal. I lost hair again. I made friends with a plastic hat. I learned the pattern of pills by heart. Yet, for every moment of pain, there was Adrian pressing an ice towel to my forehead or reading aloud from a book about lavender fields in Provence when chemo made the world taste metallic. There was a night when the treatment worked better than any of us dared to predict. I remember waking up and realizing the breath in my chest felt less like a borrowed thing. The scans showed a change, small, but enough to make the doctors use a word I hadn't heard in months: remission. We cried. Not loudly, just enough to make the hands we held tremble. Recovery looked different than I expected. It was not a big, cinematic reveal. It was a succession of ordinary days that accumulated into life. Adrian taught me how to sit in a cafe without feeling watched. I taught him how to make a roux that didn't clump. We built rituals. Sunday mornings at a farmer's market where he would argue over tomatoes like it was diplomacy. Afternoons spent at the museum, quiet nights at home when the city noise softened, and we were simply two people who had passed through something dark and come out needing each other. Houston, with its humid warmth and endless streets, became ours in small ways. He adopted a stray cat, a tiny tabby that decided my lap was the only place worth considering. We named her Miette, which Adrian insisted sounded like crumbs of pastry but softer. People asked how I felt. Some asked how we met. At the restaurant, I would say. Some faces registered surprise. Others made a small calculation and smiled as if happiness could be distributed like a neat course. We moved slowly because speed felt like a betrayal to the things we had survived. Yet one humid evening, under the soft light of my living room, Adrian took my hand and said, quietly, "I don't want to imagine a life where I only did the right thing once. I want to spend whatever time I have doing right by you." I looked at him, the man who'd seen me faint in his doorway and chosen, thereafter, to stand in the doorway of my life. He wasn't perfect. He was a man with edges and old habits, but he had learned tenderness. That mattered. "Marry me," he asked, not as a demand but as a question that assumed a future, as if he'd already penciled us into the margins of the years to come. I laughed and cried at the same time, which might be the most honest answer I could offer. "Yes," I said. "Yes, let's." We returned to Lumiere not as a wishful stranger and a cold proprietor, but as a married pair planning a small dinner for friends and a family that had expanded beyond blood. The staff greeted us like a story that had finally found its ending. The maitre d' bowed and offered a sincere apology that was no longer performative. The same couple who had once snickered at my dress now applauded when we announced our union. Life, it seemed, had a taste for irony. On the night of our wedding dinner, Adrian stood beside me as he always had, steady, present. He was careful with the speeches, not grand, just honest. He spoke about how a single moment of arrogance had taught him humility, about the strange ways life rearranges people's hearts. When he raised a glass and said, "To second chances," the clink of crystal sounded like a benediction. We ate slowly, savoring every plate. The food was excellent, not because it was expensive, but because each course had been made with someone's hands that finally grasped what mattered. After dessert, Adrian walked me to the window. The city rolled out beneath us like a map of the improbable. "You were right," he said. "That night wasn't the end. It was the beginning." I kissed him because words were small in the face of what we'd both survived. The kiss tasted faintly of creme and promise. We built a life that acknowledged fragility without letting fear run the plot. My cancer, for now, became an echo rather than a drumbeat. There were follow-up appointments and quiet anxieties, but they no longer defined the rhythm of my days. I learned that cruelty can be unwitting and that apologies are only useful when they are followed by sustained change. Adrian had chosen to be better not because he'd been forced by guilt alone, but because he had discovered, in watching me, that people are not props for a perfect dining room. We married in Houston in late spring, when the jacarandas were purple and the air smelled like promise. Miette sprawled on the rug and purred loudly whenever we walked by. Friends we had made in recovery sat at our table, and we toasted to the small mercies, clean scans, warm nights, the way a stranger can become your home. If there is one lesson I want to leave, it's this: let kindness be an action, not a headline. Let it be the daily thing you choose even when no one is watching. People will disappoint you. Institutions will fail you. But sometimes, against the odds, a person will learn to be brave for you. And if you ever find yourself in a doorway, dress pressed against your skin and hope precarious in your chest, step through. The world will not always be gentle. But you might find, waiting on the other side, a hand that has learned how to hold on. In the end, life didn't give me the night I prayed for. It gave me something better, a second chance I never expected. I walked into that restaurant believing it would be my last wish. I walked out with a man who learned how to love by learning how to change. Sometimes the world knocks you down in the cruelest ways, but sometimes, if you're patient, if you keep your heart open even when it hurts, the same world sends someone who lifts you back up, gently, quietly, without asking for anything in return. I survived. Not just the illness, but the loneliness, the fear, the shame, the nights when life felt too delicate to touch.
If this story gave you chills, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever seen play out?